she's gone before we really get to know her. We don't know if she was married or if she had any children. We don't know if she was the older sister or the younger sister or a sister at all. We don't know if she was the cool aunt. We don't know how old she was or where she was from. What we do know is that at least this part of her story takes place in Joppa, which was an ancient coastal city that's now the southern part of modern-day Tel Aviv, right on the ocean. And as a bustling seaport, Joppa likely had a large population of Gentiles as well as the native Jewish community. So we're told that she was known both as Tabitha and as Dorcas, depending on what language you spoke. And in these two names that were given for her, we hear the echo of an earlier story that helps us begin to understand what kind of woman she was. You see, just a few chapters back in the book of Acts, there was a dispute between the Hebrews and the Hellenists in Jerusalem, between the Jews and the Greeks, who complained, the Hellenists complained that their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. There was a little bit of favoritism going on. So, as good Baptists, the apostles solved this problem by forming a committee to make sure that no favoritism was shown in giving food to both the Hebrews and the Hellenists. But now we're given Tabitha Dorcas. Just down the road from Jerusalem in Joppa, she is going by both a Hebrew and a Greek name, serving all of the widows, we're told, regardless of their ethnicity or their education level or their immigration status, or go on and on and on. She was serving them all. Which is probably one of the reasons why she is introduced to us as a disciple. Which doesn't sound like a big deal. We're used to hearing the word disciple throughout the New Testament. The disciples did this and they went there. But this is a significant moment. It's a big deal because this is the only use of the feminine form of the word disciple in the entire New Testament. Tabitha Dorcas is the only woman to be called a disciple. So we know that she is unique, that she is one of a kind. One translation says that her life overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of all of those in need. She sounds like a remarkable woman, but before we can meet her for ourselves, we learn that she became sick and she died, leaving such a hole in her community that they sent for Peter, the great apostle who they heard was just in the next town over. We're not told why they sent for him. We don't know if they were looking for a miracle or if they just wanted Peter to witness their grief and to know that a true disciple had lived and moved and loved among them. And when he gets to the house where her body is laid out, we get to see evidence of her good works. As soon as Peter shows up, her mourners show him the garments that she made for them. And they start telling him the stories of all the ways that her life overflowed with compassion. Through their grief, we see how she pieced her community together with scraps of cloth and bits of thread. How with every stitch and seam she clothed her neighbors and created space for their stories to breathe. I imagine her letting out the robes of women who became pregnant and taking them in again when the time was right. I'm sure she replaced coats that were confiscated by Roman soldiers. And she repaired the accidental rips and tears that happen with daily use. I see her reinforcing the work-worn holes that form in the laborers among her community. I'm sure she transformed old cloaks into blankets and old blankets into shrouds. She was there at every pivotal moment of her community, with every transition, with every new arrival, with every goodbye. She was there until it was her turn. Before we get to meet her for ourselves, we're told that she became sick and she died unexpectedly. We arrive with Peter to see her body already laid out in an upper room. See, I'm sure some of you know this, that there's just something disorienting about being in such close proximity to death. And there's a disbelief about the finality of it. In a recent essay about his wife's death, writer Matthew Salisis described what it was like to hold his wife's hand for the last time. This young mother of 2 young kids. He writes, "I held her lifeless hand and thought, let me go back just 1 minute. I thought, don't leave me yet. Stay here." To touch her still body, completely different and yet barely changed, was to be aware that a moment is all that stands between life and death. Time was the only distance. Life felt close by. It seemed as if the only reason I couldn't go back in time was that I didn't know where time was. Death is disorienting. A few weeks ago, the well-known writer and speaker Rachel Held Evans became sick. Many of you may have heard this. And after a bad reaction to some medicine and time spent in a medically induced coma, she died. Very unexpectedly last Saturday. Like many others around the world, I was in shock when I heard the news. We are the same age, me and Rachel. We have traveled similar paths, painfully questioning the Christianity that we had grown up with, and graciously discovering the depths of God's unfathomable love in the process. Rachel was a best-selling author and a sought-after speaker. She was a wife and a mother, but most importantly, she was a woman of faith who cared deeply for others. Throughout this past week, people have been telling stories of how Rachel helped them. There's been an outpouring of people holding up the garments that Rachel made for them and sharing how she showed them how to mend the rips and the tears in their faith. One consistent theme has been how she used her platform to bring in people and voices from the margins. In her relentless pursuit of God, she recognized how the Spirit moves and breathes and speaks in the experiences of those who are at the edges. She created space for people to bring their doubts and their hurts She was a fellow pilgrim who courageously allowed the Spirit to lead her to parts unknown. She was a disciple of Christ whose life overflowed with compassion and good works. In writing about Rachel's death, a friend and colleague of hers had a similar experience to what Matthew felt holding his wife's hand for the last time. She writes, "All I could think was that we were so close to the time when she was alive that maybe we could bring her back. There is something about proximity to a particular death that makes the condition feel possibly reversible. The closer in time you are to a person's passing, the more it feels like time travel might, or at least should, be possible. Maybe that's why Tabitha's mourners asked Peter to come. Maybe her death wasn't quite real to them yet. Maybe they thought, just maybe, this apostle who had traveled with Jesus might be able to do something to reverse the irreversible. And here's where the deja vu feel of this story really comes alive, both literally and figuratively. We hear the echoes of another resurrection story when the mourners sent for Peter. In their plea, we hear the echo of messengers that brought word to Jesus that Jairus' daughter had died. And as Peter enters the upper room where Tabitha's body has been washed and laid out, we remember how Jesus approached the bedside of this little girl who had died. Peter had been there. He'd gone with Jesus into the room. He heard Jesus call to the girl, and he saw her get up. So I imagine that is on his mind as he closes the door on Tabitha's mourners. Unlike Jesus, he doesn't invite anyone to come in with him. Maybe he wanted to try to imitate Jesus and didn't want anyone watching just in case it didn't work. But after he prays and he calls to her using almost the exact same words that Jesus used to call Jairus' daughter, Tabitha opens her eyes, she sits up, he helps her to stand, and he calls to those gathered outside to come and see that she is alive. This whole episode serves as a passing of the resurrection baton. Just as Jesus' resurrection of Jairus' daughter was reminiscent of Elijah raising the widow's son, Peter, imitating Jesus by raising Tabitha, solidifies his authority as the leader of the way moving forward. But before we leave Peter to carry on the torch of Jesus' ministry, there's a final detail in the story that I want to bring to your attention. It's worth pointing out. It's really more of an absence, but it is an absence that speaks volumes. See, never one to miss a preaching opportunity, Peter is strangely silent throughout this whole scene. If you remember a few weeks ago, this is the same guy who preached to the court at his own hearing right before he was flogged. This man who preached on the steps of the temple after healing a man who couldn't walk is now silent. He doesn't say a word after calling a woman back from the dead. We're told that he prayed in the room where Tabitha was, but the only words we hear him speak are the ones that echo Jesus' call to the little girl. Tabitha, stand up. Instead of filling the space with words, instead of launching into a sermon, Peter simply shows them Tabitha. Similar to how they had held up the garments that she made for them, Peter now shows them what God has done. He shows them Tabitha, and he lets her life do the preaching. Because she lived a life that preached. With every stitch, with every kind word, with every act of charity, she preached the power of God's love to all people. Tabitha took care of those who needed help. It didn't matter where they were from or what God they prayed to, what color their skin was, where they lived. She was a woman who had two names because she was a woman that wasn't afraid to cross boundaries. I like to think that the mourners were probably so busy telling Tabitha all the things they wish they had told her when she was alive before she died, that even Peter, if he had tried to preach, his words would have been drowned out. You see, because while this story as a whole imitates an episode from Jesus' ministry and serves to establish Peter as the leader of the church moving forward, Peter is not the only one imitating Christ in this story. Weaving the strands of her community together, clothing the naked, covering the most vulnerable. Tabitha Dorcas was a disciple who imitated Christ in all that she did. In one of her most well-known books, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, Rachel Held Evans redefined the phrase used to describe the model of womanhood found in Proverbs 31. What a precious find is a woman of valor. And that phrase, woman of valor, became somewhat of a rallying cry for those who knew Rachel and her work. It's an encouraging proclamation that recognizes the depths of what it means to care for yourself and for others. Woman of valor. It's a title that bears the weight of life's grief and the delight of all that life has to offer. It's a title that knows how to dance and how to wipe away tears. It is who you are, beloved women of God. So today, in the spirit of Tabitha Dorcas, I have a gift for all of the women of valor here today. It's not a bookmark or a pen or a keychain or a nail file. It's not something that's useful or very even decorative, and it's not delicious. Sorry, it's not chocolate. What it is just a simple piece of cloth with a small two-sided card attached. One side has a poem and the other side has a blessing. It is not a lot. You deserve a lot more. But my hope is that may this cloth and this blessing and this poem remind you, you who are busy weaving your story together, may it remind you that you are loved. May it comfort you when you grieve and hold the sacred gift of your tears. And may it encourage you to let your life overflow with compassion and good works as you seek to imitate Christ. Women of valor, may you be blessed today and every day. Amen.